My dear brothers and sisters, the title of this session is The Tragedy of the Inner Death. This expression occurs in Aurobindo's epic poem Savitri in Book 2, Canto 8, line number 187, and in this edition of Savitri on page 225. So, the tragedy of the inner death. If for the moment we forget about inner and outer, connecting death with a tragedy is something that appears quite natural and normal to us. But on the other hand, you would have also heard about a person being reborn, getting a new birth, and a person cannot be reborn unless the person dies to his older self. So, one self of the person dies and gets replaced by another self, and that is a sort of a rebirth, and we consider it a blessing. Now, what is that sort of a death which we consider a blessing? That death is the outer death. And what is that outer death like? What does it consist of? One can look at it this way, that we have all within us two dogs. One is the dog called ego, which gives exclusive attention to oneself as an individual, to me as an individual, as I see myself. And the normal tendency is to identify oneself with one's body and mind. So, the ego takes care of the needs of the body and the mind, and for that, it uses as its instruments, again, the body and the mind. Which means my mind makes the type of choices, does the type of work, eats the type of food, lives in the type of house, all these things which take good care of the needs of my body and mind, and that's how I can give attention to myself as an individual. That is the ego. But then we have another dog also within us, and that is the dog of love, which looks beyond myself, looks at others, and it expresses itself by making my mind make the type of choices which would help me give what I have to those who need it. What I have may be money, an object, knowledge, time, whatever it is. And if I look around, I find that somebody else needs some of these things, and I give it to that person, and that is the dog of love. Now, to some extent, you can see that they seem to be in opposition with each other. But as we know from the spiritual point of view, and from even the ordinary point of view, it is the dog of love which actually brings us the best version of happiness, which feels better than the type of happiness which I get when I take care exclusively of my own needs. For example, I may get some happiness when I buy a new dress, but I also get some happiness when I give some clothes in charity. Now, if one reflects on this, one finds that on one hand, giving is always in one's own hands, getting is not. I may not be able to always get everything that I want, but I can always give something which I have to anybody I like. So, it gives me control. Control over what? Control over the type of happiness which I get when I give something. And the happiness that I get when I give that something, say to somebody who is shivering in cold, and I give some woolens and that person feels warm. Now, the type of joy that I get, and that's why we call it joy, not just happiness. Joy, is a word that conveys a better version of happiness. The joy that I get by giving surpasses the happiness of getting. So, the joy of giving is always feels better than the happiness of getting, and at the same time, it is always in my own hands, because I can always give something. I may not be able to get everything that I want. Now, not being dependent upon anything or anybody to be able to give something is a freedom. Because for that I don't depend upon anybody. Whereas to get something I would depend on many things, people, etc., etc. Now, overcoming this dependence, getting that freedom which gives me control over my happiness and gives me a better version of happiness, is something which we can easily understand without going any deeper into spirituality. So we have these two dogs, the dog of the ego, which looks at me as an individual and pays exclusive attention to my own desires and wants. And further extension is, it also pampers my own way of thinking about things. My opinion is better than yours. My truth is higher than yours. And then collectively, my nation is superior to other nations. My religion is better than other religions. My guru is better than somebody else's guru, and so on and so forth. These are all different expressions of this I-ness and my-ness and me. So that is the ego. The other dog is love, that of love, which makes me look beyond myself, and we find that that can be a source of great joy and freedom. Now, out of these two, which is the dog that will live longer and thrive, and which is the dog which will starve and die? The dog called ego is an arrogant, aggressive dog. The dog called love is a mild and meek dog. But it is not this aggressive nature or the meekness that determines which of these two dogs will survive and live longer. What determines is which of these two dogs I feed better, which of these two I feed more frequently, which of these two dogs I'll take better care of and love more. Now, if I keep feeding the dog of ego, and its needs can be endless, I can spend all my life just taking care of that. And love may enter occasionally as an aberration. That is one type of life. So I am feeding the dog of ego well, and therefore the dog of love continues to starve and may eventually, if not die, at least go into a coma. On the other hand, if I feed the dog of love, the dog called ego gets starved, and that keeps getting weaker. Now it is feeding the dog of love and starving the dog of ego which leads to this rebirth, the rebirth that we celebrate. How does that happen? Why do we call it a rebirth? Because now I become a different type of person. From a selfish individual, I become a selfless individual. I move from selfishness towards selflessness. And that reflects in my outer behavior. And you can see it's basically the mind which is determining it. The body is a docile instrument that will do whatever the mind tells it to do. So it's basically how I am using my mind which changes me from one type of person to another. And how is it possible to do that and understand that? By being aware of an inner light, my soul, which is the divine essence of the person, which normally gets some sort of obscured, or there is sort of a screen or a veil or a barrier between which and the surface mind, that is the emotional part of being the intellect. So by gradually weakening this barrier, I am able to illumine the emotional part of the being and the intellect with this light. And that is what helps me feed the dog of love and starve the one of ego. And eventually, when I become a different type of person as a result of this, and I reflect back, how was I 10 years ago and how am I today? I feel now I'm a new person. So what has died is the dog of ego, and the result is that now I'm a different type of person. This may be called a rebirth. Now this is what we celebrate. This is what we consider a blessing. And why do we call it an outer death? Because it is visible on the surface. The surface mind has changed. My outer behavior has changed. And therefore, we say that on the outside, I was a different type of person, and now I'm in a different type of person. And it has happened because I let something within persist and prevail. And what was that? My divine essence. I let that speak. I identified that voice. I recognized the value of that voice, the merit of that voice, and I saw that it was in my own interest to let that voice prevail, and organized my life more and more around that. And that is what helped me die and get a new birth. My old self, self with a small s, died, and a new type of self, a self with a capital S, started emerging. And this can happen on a day-to-day basis, so one can die every day and be reborn every day, a little better me than I was yesterday. And that way, this can be looked at sort of in small blocks of maybe a day at a time. Each day one can be born to some extent, get a new birth, or it may become more obvious and apparent only when the change is bigger, and that may be in blocks of 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years, or whatever. So anyway, so it's possible to have this type of an outer death, and it is a blessing, and we can celebrate it. Now you may say that if outer death is a blessing, then the converse would be that the inner death is a tragedy. And that is exactly what the title is, the tragedy of the inner death. So one can say that if the outer death is a blessing, inner death would be a tragedy. If something is true, its converse would also be true. But then it need not necessarily always be, and therefore it does require a bit of further elaboration, because after all, life is not mathematics. In mathematics, it may be true that if something is true, the converse will also be true, but that may not always apply to life. So let's elaborate a bit on what actually the title is, that is, the tragedy of the inner death. Now, what is it that leads to this inner death? What leads to this inner death is clinging to the outer surface as it is, not letting it die. Which means that I do not make any effort to change myself. I do not make an effort to live a life which is organized primarily around my own little self as an individual. I do not let that die. And why that can happen is because it feels cozy, it feels comfortable, it feels good, and it takes care of my needs, and therefore I can close my eyes to something higher. I can continue to ignore that faint whisper that I get from my soul, and somehow convince myself that it's okay. After all, I'm a human being, I'm not a devta, I'm not a god. I can keep convincing myself. And that's how one can go on clinging to the outer, stay in that comfort zone, and instead of letting it die, we keep pampering it. I cling to it, I pamper it, I don't let it die, I don't let it even get weaker. There's a beautiful poem by Rashmi Trivedi, and the title of the poem is My Dying Conscience. The conscience is not exactly the same as that inner voice of coming from the divine essence, which Aurobindo and the mother call the psychic being. So the conscience is not the same, exactly the same as the psychic being, but for the moment, in this context, it will really make no difference. And let's see what she says in this poem. The title is My Dying Conscience. Sometimes in the dark of the night, I visit my conscience to see if it is still breathing, for it's dying a slow death every day. So she's talking about the death of the conscience, or you can say the death of that divine essence, the deeper self, and that is exactly what this is, the tragedy of the inner death, that is the death of that divine essence within. So she examines every day whether that deeper self is still alive, which she calls conscience here. Sometimes in the dark of the night, I visit my conscience to see if it is still breathing, for it's dying a slow death every day. When I pay for a meal in a fancy place, an amount which is perhaps the monthly income of the guard who holds the door open, and quickly I shrug away that thought, it dies a little. When I buy vegetables from the vendor and his son Chotu smilingly weighs the potatoes, Chotu, a small child who should be studying at school, I look the other way, it dies a little. When I am decked up in a designer dress, a dress that cost a bomb, and I see a woman at the crossing in tatters, trying unsuccessfully to save her dignity, and I immediately roll up my window, it dies a little. When my sick maid sends her daughter to work, making her bunk school, I know I should tell her to go back, but I look at the loaded sink and dirty dishes, and I tell myself, that is just for a couple of days. It dies a little. When I hear about a rape or a murder of a child, I feel sad, yet a little thankful that it's not my child. I cannot look at myself in the mirror. It dies a little. When people fight over caste, creed, and religion, I feel hurt and helpless. I tell myself that my country is going to the dogs. I blame the corrupt politicians, absolving myself of all responsibilities. It dies a little. When my city is choked, breathing is dangerous in the smog-ridden city, I take my car to work daily. Not taking the metro, not taking the carpool, one car won't make a difference, I think. It dies a little. So when in the dark of the night I visit my conscience and find it still breathing, I am surprised. For with my own hands, daily, bit by bit, I bury it. So this is a beautiful illustration of how we cling to that outer self, centered around myself as an individual, not letting it die, and in the process we keep starving that dog of love. But then, does it mean that we necessarily spend our whole life like that? No, very often we do make progress, we do change, and we get reborn. We celebrate that blessing also comes. And how does that come? That comes as a result of difficulties, traumatic events that we go through in life. And it is in those moments of crises that we realize that we are not as self-sufficient, not as much capable of everything in life on our own as we think. There can be situations in which we feel totally helpless, and then we turn to that higher force, and we find that representative of that higher force within. And that's how not only we realize that we need some assistance from outside, from that higher force, whose instruments materialize in the form of helpful people. And the result is that we realize that if I need that sort of a help from others, others also need that sort of help. I should reciprocate. So in other words, gradually I start changing as a person, and instead of remaining confined to my own needs, I start taking care of the needs of others. And to some extent, this sort of going beyond oneself is built into the life cycle. Taking care of the partner, taking care of the children, and so on and so forth, is a part of that process of ego expansion, the widening of the ego circle. And this process need not be limited to the biological family. It can keep extending, it can keep stretching, and a time may come when this barrier completely disappears to the extent that when the circle is so wide that it includes all creation, then it's as good as there being no barrier. But then one has to, of course, keep in mind that it is very easy to say, I love all humanity, and so on and so forth. What is more difficult is to love a few real people. And therefore, how does this translate, this total breakdown of the barrier on one hand, and on the other hand, loving a few real people? How do we reconcile it? The way we reconcile it is that I take care of a few individuals. I can't take care of the whole world. Just because I love the whole world doesn't mean that I can really take care of the whole world. But what I can do is that I can take care of the needs of the individuals who need what I can give. I can't give what I don't have. I take care of those individuals who are near me, who happen to be in front of me, regardless of other considerations, such as whether they are part of my biological family, whether they have some other objective relationship with me, objectively defined. Are they my colleagues? Are they my neighbors? And so on and so forth. Do they think like me? Do they dress like me? Do they speak like me? Do they speak the same language? Now, without any of these considerations, if I just take care of the individuals who happen to be near me, an individual who happens to be in front of me, and I find that this individual needs what I can give, I forget all those other considerations, so-called objective considerations, and I just help this person because this is also an individual who is a manifestation of the divine. He needs what I can give, I give it. So if I do that, I overcome that barrier. For that, I don't have to take care of the needs of the whole world because I can't. In fact, it's easier to say I love everybody. But if I take care of even one real individual in that fashion, that is a step forward in the same direction, in the direction towards that outer death, which we celebrate, and one more fortifying dose, one more meal, sumptuous meal for the dog called love. And that's how it can happen. But then, how do I turn in that direction? I turn in that direction when I realize my own helplessness in some difficult situation. So it's generally through those crises, those traumatic events, that we reach there. Which means that I have to go through difficult times myself to be able to live a meaningful life. And that's what Aurobindo says in the same canto, book 2, canto 8, a few 2 pages later, after this tragedy of the inner death, he says, none can reach heaven who has not passed through hell. So to be able to get to heaven, we have to pass through hell. We have to go through those difficult times. That seems to be a necessity. But then is it an absolute necessity? Once Aurobindo was asked, he said, no, it is not an absolute necessity. It becomes essential because of the resistance that we offer. If no resistance is offered, then it would not be essential. What offers that resistance? Primarily the emotional part of the being. That is what offers that resistance. It is that emotional part of the being which makes me feel, well, one car makes no difference. I don't want to go by metro. I don't want to try and put together a carpool. One car won't make any difference. I convince myself. And what is it that resists the metro and the carpool? The emotional part of the being. So we offer a resistance. I shouldn't let the maid's daughter work. She should be going to school. I should send her back. Don't bunk school, go back. But then the sink is full of dishes. So it will be an unpleasant experience for me to do those dishes. So to avoid that unpleasant experience, I let her do it. After all, missing school for a day won't make any difference. Let her do it. Now, which means that we offer resistance. That voice speaks from within. But then we offer resistance, and that is why eventually for that sort of a change, that is the outer death, so that a newer, better, higher self emerges in clearer contours. It starts expressing itself in my outer life. For that to happen, I have to go through hell. So none can reach heaven who has not passed through hell. Another beautiful set of lines which Aurobindo has given in this very canto, which explains why the mind is able to prevail over that genuine voice of the soul or the psychic being. He says that a seeking mind replaces the seeing soul. The soul sees, so it's a seeing soul, which means it can directly see the truth, the whole truth. But then it gets replaced by what? A seeking mind. A mind that seeks. What does it seek? Not even knowledge necessarily. not truth, what does it seek? It seeks comfort. It seeks security. And the two have such a contrast. In one of the letters that Aurobindo wrote about Savitri, trying to explain somebody this part of Savitri, he described the voice of the psychic being as an unerring perception, true choice, and harmonic action. Unerring perception makes no mistakes because it is a part of our divine essence. The divine knows all and therefore it can make no mistakes. So, unerring perception. True choice, the best choice, the most authentic choice, the choice would be based on the spiritual worldview, that is a choice which would be based on a sense of love and oneness. The two go together. I love somebody only if I feel one with that person. And the spiritual basis of that oneness is that we are all manifestations of the same divine, all rays of the same sun, or in simple words, children of the same God. So, that is what gives me the capacity, looking at the others in that light, gives me the capacity to make a true choice. And that comes from my own divine essence, the soul within. So, what are the characteristics of this inner voice of the psychic being or this dynamic aspect of the soul? Unerring perception, true choice, and harmonic action. Harmony between what? Harmony between the emotional part of the being, the intellect, and the soul. That is, the surface mind and the soul become one. They become one at least for that brief moment every time I make a choice which is based on the voice of the psychic being. Because at that time, my soul has said something and the mind has quickly seen this is something which is going to give me immense joy and lasting mental peace. So the emotional part of the being has agreed with the voice of the soul. And the intellect has also found a reason to justify it and come to the conclusion, this is the only right thing to do. So the emotional part of the being, the intellect and the soul have come together in one voice, at least for that brief moment, when, say, I tell the maid's daughter, go back home, better go to school, at least I will not let you work in my house. So at that moment, what has happened is, this joy of sending her back home, I find, feels better than not doing the dishes. So not doing the dishes gives me one type of comfort, sending her back home gives me another type of joy, and I have made that choice. So for that brief moment, the three have come together, the emotional part of the being, the intellect and the soul. So that is harmonic action. So unerring perception, true choice and harmonic action. In contrast, this is the seeing soul. This is how the seeing soul works. How does the seeking mind work? In just the opposite fashion. Instead of unerring perception, it's full of errors. It's full of errors. Because with very partial and limited knowledge, you cannot have an unerring perception. Leave aside big things. You can't have even an unerring perception of me. Why? Because you may be judging me from a very limited angle from the type of talk I am giving. But that is not me. With a limited and partial view of me, and just listening to me speaking in this hall, you will have a much better impression of me than I truly am. So, with a partial knowledge, you always arrive at a skewed conclusion. So, instead of unerring perception, this conclusion of the mind is full of errors. True choice? No. Because it's a seeking mind, it will not make a true choice. Instead, what will it choose? Something which can be justified in objective terms. Which means choice which will give me something which can be measured. For example, I'll make the type of choice which increases the bank balance. And how will the bank balance go up? If I don't part with my money. Then I can keep the bank balance at a good level. So, the objective choice which can be measured, because one can't measure the joy that I get by giving. Parting with some money to somebody who needs it. That gives me joy, But then one can't say how much joy. 2 kilos of joy or 5 kilos of joy. Can't be measured. Bank balance conserved by this much. So many rupees. That can be measured, but joy cannot be measured. So instead of true choice, an objective choice. All the time this analysis going on. Profit and loss analysis, risk and benefit analysis, and the choice is very objective, where the profit is maximum, loss is minimum, risk is minimum, benefit is maximum. So instead of an unerring perception, a perception full of errors, instead of a true choice, an objective choice, and harmonic action, impossible. Why? Because even if that inner voice coming from the deeper self is not being paid heed to, we are not acting upon it, it still keeps putting in that faint whisper. So there's a disharmony. Disharmony between the voice of that psychic being, that inner voice, the voice of love, and what I decide in my surface mind through some sort of a collaboration between the emotional part of the being and the intellect. So the emotional part of the being, the intellect, can easily work out some sort of a understanding with each other, and the soul keeps whispering in that dissenting voice, so lack of harmony. So just see the contrast, unerring perception, true choice and harmonic action. In comparison with that, the mind which I ordinarily use has an erroneous perception, makes objective but not true choices, and always leads to disharmony in my actions. But in spite of it, what does the mind think of itself? Very arrogant. And we make a choice to place reason or the intellect on the highest pedestal and place great reliance on it. We feel that this is what will give me the best choices because it will take care of all the losses, all the risks that I can have, gives me a sense of false security. Why false security? Because all the security that I build up on the basis of this type of calculations can be proved completely useless in just one moment. But in spite of that vanity, that tendency to place great reliance, to believe that I'll get the best choices from this mind, particularly the intellect, continues to persist. And then how do we justify it? We justify it by finding reasons, by finding scapegoats. The government is not doing enough for this and not doing enough for that. So the government becomes the scapegoat. I don't think of what I can do. So find scapegoats. Try to appear at least better on the outside than I am inside. Hypocrisy. And finally, I convince myself that I'm okay, I'm doing the right things, which means I start cheating myself. Self-deception. And that is how I keep justifying this mind till some traumatic event wakes me up and leads to that awakening and helps me become at least a little different tomorrow than I am today, the death of the outer self, a new birth. Till that happens, I just continue to justify myself using all these tricks of the intellect. Now, if with good luck, through traumatic events or otherwise, I am able to make some progress by changing my faulty, erroneous outer self and letting that inner self, deeper self emerge so that it gets reflected in my outer behavior more and more. Fine, but if that does not happen, eventually what happens is that this dog of love gets starved to the point that it dies. And that is what inner death is about. But then one might say that it is after all the divine essence. How can it die? The soul is immortal. Well, it doesn't really die, but it can go into a deep sleep or into a coma and stay there, eventually perhaps even stop speaking, even that faint whisper stops. And that's how the whole life can pass. And then comes the true outer death as we think of it, that is, the soul leaves, leaving the body behind. Once, the founder of this ashram, whom we fondly call Chachaji, he was with another much younger person, Dr. Premanand Kumar. Please excuse me if I digress a bit. Dr. Premanand Kumar is the daughter of Professor K.R.S. Iyengar. Professor K.R.S. Iyengar is the author of about 40 books, but 2 of those books are the biographies of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, respectively. And these are, each of these biographies is about 1,000-page long. And these are extremely well-referenced, well-researched biographies, one of Sri Aurobindo and the other of the mother, both about 1,000 pages each. His daughter, Dr. Premanand Kumar, is also a PhD in English, and her PhD thesis was on Savitri. So this person, Dr. Premanand Kumar, she and the founder of this ashram, Chachaji, once went out for a morning walk to a park. And in the park they found a large group of senior citizens, older people, we call them senior citizens, sitting and gossiping. And you can understand the type of gossip that generally happens ordinarily in parks like that. They would be all complaining about their children and their daughters-in-law, and particularly, and so on. How much they did for their children, and what they are paying back, and how they are treating them, and so on and so forth. And being on the same page, their ideas can resonate with each other. And when they get tired of that, then they'll start criticizing the government and what all is wrong that the government is doing, and what they would do instead, and what should be done instead. And then they'll start talking of international relations and how which country is doing something right and which country is doing something wrong, and if only they could behave better, how much better the world would become. So over those hour or two that they gossip, they would have solved all national and international problems. That is how the time gets spent, quite often. So Chachaji asked Dr. Premanand Kumar, what are these people doing? She said, they have come for a morning walk. But what are they doing? They are talking to each other. But what are they doing? They are gossiping. But what are they doing? She said, well, I can't think of anything more. Aap bataiye. You tell me what they are doing. Chachaji said, they are waiting for death. They are waiting for death. That is for the soul to depart and the body to be left behind. That is what we normally call death. Now, why did he say that? Why he said that is because that is how much of our life is actually spent, somehow negotiating through all the ups and downs of life, but essentially staying as we arrive in this world. And finally we reach a stage when the bodily frame is frail, no more worldly responsibilities, and even if they are there, we can easily run away from them, because at this age you can't expect much from me. That's always a good excuse. So one can always escape those and then just enjoy this type of gossip with people who are all at the same stage of life. And essentially they are not yet dead because they are still breathing, and they know they will go, and they are waiting for death and trying to make that wait as pleasant as possible through this sort of gossip. So essentially that's what he meant. And why that happens is because we always have some reason for not going on a little inner exploration, going on an inner journey which will take us in a direction which will not only make our life full of that joy and peace, but will also make the world a better place to live in. So instead of going in that, as children, we feel that, this is the time to play and enjoy life. When we are in school, I have to think of my career, so I should work hard. That is the only thing that I have to think of. And then there may come a time, then one has a family, that keeps me occupied. It's so much to care for. Life is so difficult. I have to take care of not only the expenses, but I also have to take care of so many things. Today the servant has run away, today the driver has not come, today the electricity bill has to be paid, and today the house tax has to be paid, and today I need a carpenter to come and do something at home, and today I need a plumber, and today I need an electrician, and so on and so forth. And yesterday I parked my car wrongly, so it was towed away, and so I have to get the car, and so many 101 things. So I feel so much to do. What else can I think of? Then a bit of relief comes at a certain stage in life. But then I tend to cling on one hand to the same children about whom I am complaining when I go for a morning walk. I can't think of any other type of existence. So this is how one can spend one's whole life. It reminds me of that bhajan, Sara janam baaton mein beet gaya. So you can spend your childhood, youth, old age, everything without really going a little deeper and giving a serious thought to what life is all about. What is the true purpose of life and how it can be served. How I can have an outer death without actually dying in the usual sense of the word. How I can have that outer death so that a new self can emerge, a deeper self can emerge and start expressing itself in my outer life, which will make my own life more pleasant and also useful for others. I think the best way to finish this would be a few lines from Savitri, where actually this expression, the tragedy of the inner death, appears on page 225 in this edition of Savitri. And this passage can be considered actually a beautiful description of death as we ordinarily understand it, that is the soul departing, leaving the body behind. A silence falls upon the spirit's heights. From the veiled sanctuary the god retires, empty and cold is the chamber of the bride. A silence falls upon the spirit's heights. The spirit or the soul is now silent. It's no longer whispering in this body. It's no longer whispering to this mind. A silence falls upon the spirit's heights. From the veiled sanctuary, the god retires. God was in a sort of a veiled, a hidden, a concealed place within this individual. From there, God retires, takes flight from there, retires to some other place. And what is the result? Empty and cold is the chamber of the bride. Here Aurobindo has compared the soul to a bride, bride with a capital B. Here. Empty and cold is the chamber of the bride. So where the bride was in this individual, now it is empty. It is empty and cold because that warmth of love is missing. A silence falls upon the spirit's heights. From the veiled sanctuary the god retires. Empty and cold is the chamber of the bride. What else happens? The golden nimbus now is seen no more. No longer burns the white spiritual ray, and hushed forever is the secret voice. So long as this bride, the psychic being, the soul was there, this divine essence was intact, this body was inhabited by that divine essence, the matter, inconscient matter, had that divine essence active and working in it. At least it had a little golden rim around it. The golden nimbus now is seen no more. That has disappeared with the bride, which means that in a way sort of God has also given up on this individual. In this body, in this life on earth, not much is expected of this person, and it has left. The golden nimbus now is seen no more, no longer burns the white spiritual ray. So that nimbus has disappeared, a little ray, bright ray that was there, that has disappeared, and hushed forever is the secret voice. This voice which was speaking from a secret chamber is no longer there. It has been hushed into silence. So this dead body is lying, the soul has departed. What is going on in some other world? In the heavens? Then by the angel of the vigil tower, a name is struck from the recording book. So each person corresponding to each individual on earth, imagine it's a good sort of way to look at it, and that there is an angel who is keeping a watch, who has a register in which everybody's name is there, and is going on sort of writing and this much minus this much and so on, depending upon how we are living this life. So now that this individual's body is here, the soul has departed, one chapter in the journey of the soul has come to an end. In this particular form, with this particular name, this individual is gone. So now this name can be struck off. Need not keep any more accounts for this name, this person in this form in the world. So a name is struck from the recording book. A flame that sang in heaven sinks quenched and mute. So long as this person was here and the soul was there, that bride was there in that chamber, it had a resonance in heaven. So it was, the flame was here on earth, but it also was singing in heaven. Now that it has left that particular slot is no longer required. So in heavens, this particular flame is no longer singing, it is quenched and mute. So the name is been struck off the register, this flame is mute. In ruin ends the epic of a soul. So what is left behind is only the ruins. The body is a sort of a ruin. This is the tragedy of the inner death. And how does it happen? Why does it happen? This is the tragedy of the inner death when forfeited is the divine element and only a mind and body live to die. So this happens when the divine element within is forfeited. We possess it, but we give it up. We behave as if it doesn't exist. We give all the importance to this arrogant, erroneous, self-seeking mind and ignore this seeing soul instead. So when we do forfeit that, the divine element or the divine essence within us, then what is left is, in life is, a mind and a body. A mind and a body live. So they continue to live. The mind taking care of its own needs and the physical needs of the body, supervised by the ego. But then they do live, but for what? To no useful purpose. They live to die. So that one day they. So that is what Chachaji said, waiting for death. So live to die. The mind and the body live to die. Let me read these lines again. This is on page 225, book 2, Canto 8. Starting with the line 177. A silence falls upon the spirit's heights. From the veiled sanctuary the god retires. Empty and cold is the chamber of the bride. The golden nimbus now is seen no more. No longer burns the white spiritual ray, and hushed forever is the secret voice. Then by the angel of the vigil tower, a name is struck from the recording book. A flame that sang in heaven sinks quenched and mute. In ruin ends the epic of a soul. This is the tragedy of the inner death, when forfeited is the divine element, and only a mind and body live to die.